Have you ever felt like a room went cold the moment you walked in, like conversations stopped, smiles stiffened, and suddenly you were the problem no one could quite explain? Not because you did something wrong, but because your presence alone exposed something they were trying to hide. There was a season where it felt coordinated, subtle exclusions, half-truths, twisted narratives, invitations that somehow never reached you, support that quietly turned into silence. You questioned yourself more than once. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I really am the issue. But deep down, your spirit never fully agreed with the story they tried to write about you. And that inner resistance? That was not pride. That was discernment. Because what you experienced was not random rejection. It was strategic removal. Not by them, but through them. There is a difference. Some people don't distance you because you're toxic. They distance you because your clarity threatens their illusion. Your growth exposes their stagnation. Your integrity highlights their compromise. So they form quiet alliances, not always out of hatred, but out of shared discomfort. And while it looked like they were pushing you out, heaven was actually pulling you aside. What felt like social death was spiritual extraction. What felt like betrayal was divine interruption. You weren't being isolated to be diminished. You were being separated to be preserved. Think about it. Every time you tried to stay, something made it uncomfortable. Every time you forced connection, something felt off. Conversations became shallow. Energy became heavy. Your soul felt tired in rooms where your mask had to work overtime. That wasn't anxiety without reason. That was your spirit recognizing misalignment before your mind could explain it. And when the separation finally happened, it hurt. Not just because of who left, but because of who you thought they were. You grieved friendships that never truly existed, loyalty that was conditional, and love that depended on your silence. But what you didn't see in that moment was the protection wrapped inside the pain. Some environments can celebrate you and still contaminate you. Some relationships can love you and still limit you. You were not removed because you failed. You were removed because you were about to outgrow a space that could no longer hold your calling. The isolation was not a punishment. It was preparation. In the quiet, your identity was rebuilt without their projections. In the distance, your confidence returned without their commentary. In the loneliness, your connection with the divine grew louder than the noise of human opinion. What they thought was your downfall became your refinement. What they meant as exclusion became your elevation. And now, when you look back, you don't feel the same sting. You feel clarity. You see how close you were to shrinking, just to stay included. You see how much of yourself you were about to trade for temporary belonging. That door didn't close to trap you outside. It closed to stop you from going back in. If this resonates, type "I am chosen" in the comments. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, because what you thought was an ending was a rescue mission in disguise. Now let's dive deeper. Point 1. The isolation was protection, not punishment. Stay with me closely here, because this part requires you to release the story you've been telling yourself about what happened. For a long time, you interpreted the distance, the silence, and the exclusion as evidence that you had done something wrong. Your mind searched for mistakes, the way fingers search for a light switch in a dark room. You replayed conversations. You analyzed your tone. You wondered if you were too honest, too quiet, too different, too intense, too distant, too much. or somehow not enough. That mental spiral did not come from vanity. It came from your desire to stay connected. But what if the separation was never a verdict on your worth? What if it was a boundary placed around your destiny before you could shrink yourself to stay acceptable? There are seasons when remaining included would actually be more dangerous than being pushed out. Environments have ceilings, social circles have emotional climates. And when your internal growth begins to exceed the emotional maturity of the people around you, tension forms. Not because you are trying to outgrow them, but because growth naturally stretches space. If you had stayed, you would have felt pressure to dim your insight, soften your boundaries, dilute your vision, laugh at things that no longer felt funny, and agree with perspectives your spirit had already outgrown. That slow compromise is how purpose quietly dies. So, instead of letting you erode from the inside, life allowed a rupture on the outside. It felt like loss, but it functioned like rescue. The loneliness that followed was not evidence of abandonment. It was the emotional detox that comes when unhealthy attachment cords are being dissolved. Detox is uncomfortable. You crave what you are being cleansed from. You miss people who are not actually safe for your future. You feel empty before you feel free. That in-between space is sacred, even when it hurts. Because in that quiet, stripped-down season, you are no longer performing a role to maintain belonging. You are meeting yourself without an audience. And that meeting is the foundation of real power. Protection rarely feels gentle while it is happening. A seatbelt bruises in a crash. A cast itches while a bone heals. In the same way, divine protection can feel like social injury while it is actually preserving your long-term destiny. You are not being punished. You are being prevented from tying your future to people who could only love the version of you that stayed small. Point 2. They united over confusion, not truth. When multiple people begin treating you differently at the same time, it creates the illusion that there must be a solid reason. If they all feel this way, it must be true. That assumption is powerful, and it is often wrong. Groups do not always unite around facts. They often unite around shared feelings. One person's insecurity becomes another person's suspicion. Someone feels intimidated, but calls it concern. Someone feels left behind, but calls it discernment. Someone feels exposed, but calls it intuition. And slowly, a narrative forms that has emotional agreement, but very little evidence. Humans are wired for social alignment. It feels safer to agree with the group than to stand alone in uncertainty. So instead of asking, "Is this accurate?" people ask, "Who else feels this way?" Agreement becomes a substitute for investigation. And once a narrative hardens, every neutral action you take gets filtered through that lens. Your silence becomes arrogance. Your focus becomes selfishness. Your boundaries become attitude. Your peace becomes distance. You are no longer being seen for who you are. You are being interpreted through a story you didn't write. But here is the deeper psychological truth. Projection feels like perception to the person doing it. When someone has not healed their own feelings of inadequacy, your confidence can feel like a personal attack. When someone is unsure of their path, your clarity can feel like judgment. When someone is compromising their values, your integrity can feel like exposure. Instead of confronting their discomfort, it is easier to reframe you as the problem. And when several people share similar unhealed areas, they validate each other's distortions. This does not make them evil. It makes them unconscious. But unconscious agreement can still create real consequences. You felt the weight of that collective misunderstanding. Yet unity around confusion does not turn confusion into truth. History is filled with moments where the majority misjudged the minority that carried insight ahead of its time. Being outnumbered does not mean being wrong. Sometimes it means you are early. Point 3. Someone was always watching quietly. While the loudest voices formed conclusions, there was always a quieter presence in the background. Maybe it was one person, maybe several. They did not join the criticism, but they also did not speak up at first. From your perspective, their silence felt like betrayal too. But silence does not always mean agreement. Sometimes it means observation. There are people who need time to process what they see. They notice inconsistencies. They sense when stories don't fully add up. They watch how you respond under pressure. They observe whether your character changes when you are misunderstood. While others react quickly, these observers gather data slowly. Divine justice often works through these quiet witnesses. Not everyone assigned to your vindication will announce themselves early. Some are positioned to see the full picture before truth is revealed. You may never know all the ways your name was defended in rooms you never entered. You may never hear the conversations where someone said, "That doesn't sound like them," or "I've never seen that side," or "Maybe there's more to this." But those seeds of doubt in the false narrative matter. Because truth does not need a crowd at first. It needs a foothold. Over time, patterns expose themselves. Inconsistencies grow harder to ignore. The emotional intensity of false stories fades, and what remains is observable character. And character has a way of speaking for itself across time. The person who once stayed neutral begins to see clearly, not because you campaigned for their support, but because reality is difficult to suppress forever. Vindication rarely arrives as applause. It arrives as quiet shifts in perception, as people slowly realize they misjudged you, as doors are opening in places you didn't try to force, as new alliances are forming without you begging to be understood. Someone is seeing the truth now, even if you don't have proof yet. Point 4. Your silence was strength, not weakness. One of the hardest things you had to live through was the urge to defend yourself and the choice not to. You had evidence, you had explanations, you had perspectives that could have changed how people saw the situation. And yet, something in you hesitated, not out of fear of confrontation, but out of an inner knowing that fighting this battle might cost more than it would restore. There are conflicts where the real trap is not losing your reputation, but losing your peace. If you had entered every argument, corrected every rumor, exposed every inconsistency, you might have won some short-term validation, but you also would have tied your emotional state to people determined not to understand you. You would have drained your energy trying to change minds that were not open. Your silence was not passivity, it was discernment. You recognized, even if you couldn't explain it at the time, that some misunderstandings are temporary assignments, not permanent definitions. You chose to protect your inner stability instead of chasing external approval. That is psychological maturity. The ego wants immediate correction. The spirit values long-term alignment. While others interpreted your quietness as guilt, indifference, or defeat, it was actually evidence of inner anchoring. You knew who you were, even when others were unsure. You trusted that if you stayed consistent, time would reveal what arguments could not. Self-restraint is one of the highest forms of power. Anyone can react. Few can remain grounded while being misjudged. Your composure under social pressure refined you. It strengthened your emotional independence. It taught you that you can survive being misunderstood and still remain whole. That realization changes how you move forever. Point 5. You were being repositioned, not rejected. Rejection feels like being pushed away from something you wanted. Repositioning is being moved towards something you cannot yet see. At the time, all you could feel was the loss, the absence of familiar voices, the empty spaces where connection used to be, the routines that no longer included you. But removal creates room, and room is necessary for new alignments. If those relationships had continued unchanged, you would not have had the emotional or practical space to step into the next environment prepared for you. Familiarity can be a cage when growth begins. People who only know your past self often struggle to relate to your evolving self. They expect the same patterns, the same availability, and the same limitations. When you start shifting, it disrupts the balance they were comfortable with. Rather than adjusting, they sometimes withdraw. What felt like being discarded was actually making space for people who meet the version of you that exists now, not the one you used to be. Repositioning often happens before replacement appears. That gap can feel like abandonment, but it is actually transition, a hallway between rooms. You cannot fully step into new connections while still clinging to old ones that no longer fit. So the season of reduced social noise was creating capacity. Capacity for deeper, more aligned relationships. Capacity for opportunities that require focus. Capacity for self-trust that doesn't depend on constant validation. You are not being told you are unworthy of connection. You are being guided toward connections that do not require you to betray yourself to maintain them. Point 6. The truth always has a due date. In the immediate aftermath of being misunderstood, it can feel like the world has quietly sided against you, like whispers traveled faster than your truth ever could, like distance grew overnight without explanation. Invitations stop. Conversations feel colder. The atmosphere shifts, and there is no public correction, no dramatic moment where the record is set straight. It feels final. But what feels permanent is often just noise with a short lifespan. False narratives carry a hidden flaw. They are high maintenance. They need constant retelling, emotional intensity, and selective memory to stay alive. They depend on people staying triggered, staying convinced, and staying aligned with a version of events that usually begins to blur at the edges. Over time, that becomes tiring. Details get fuzzy. The outrage loses heat. Life introduces new experiences that don't match the story people were told about you. And slowly, almost invisibly, cracks begin to form. Truth does not rush. Truth stabilizes. It works quietly through consistency, through your unchanged character, through your calm, grounded behavior that refuses to match the villain role you were assigned. People start noticing small contradictions, then bigger ones, then personal experiences that don't line up with the old narrative. And somewhere, in a private moment you may never witness, someone thinks, maybe we misunderstood them. That silent realization is powerful, because perception shifts always happen internally before they show up externally. You may never receive an apology. You may never get a public reversal, but you will notice subtle changes, warmer energy, unexpected opportunities, and doors opening in rooms that once felt closed. That is truth doing its work. Closure does not always arrive through conversation. Sometimes it arrives through elevation, through becoming so aligned, so steady, and so far removed from the old environment that vindication becomes unnecessary. Point 7. Your loneliness was the birthplace of your power. The most transformative part of this entire journey was the season you least wanted, the quiet. The nights when you had no one to call, the days when you felt invisible, the moments when you wondered if anyone truly saw you. In that stripped-down space, you met yourself without distraction. You faced your fears without social noise to drown them out. You learned how to sit with your thoughts instead of escaping into constant interaction. That solitude strengthened muscles you didn't know you needed. Emotional self-reliance, spiritual discernment, internal validation. You stopped measuring your worth by who included you. You started measuring your alignment by how peaceful you felt within yourself. That shift is power. Because once you are no longer afraid of being alone, you stop tolerating spaces that compromise you just to avoid loneliness. You choose connection from wholeness, not from need. The very season that felt like deprivation was actually construction. Your identity was being rebuilt on a foundation that cannot be shaken by group opinion. You are not the same person who was excluded. You are more grounded, more aware, more selective, and more aligned. And now, as truth begins to surface and new paths begin to open, you can walk forward without bitterness. Not because what happened didn't hurt, but because you understand it had purpose. You were not ganged up on to be erased. You were set apart to be elevated. And the clarity coming now is not just about them seeing the truth. It is about you seeing your own strength clearly for the first time.